Welcome to the Kyperian Commentary Podcast. This is episode 137, and I have Brian Sove with me on the podcast. Welcome, Brian. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, Rick. It's good to be here and glad to sit down with you.
Yeah, this is fun. The reason I wanted to have you on here is basically to talk about social media. I've interacted with you a few times on social media, and as a realm for pastors to, I think, have sort of an outsized voice in the culture. It's a really unique tool that we have today. I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about your social media thoughts, strategies, how it relates to your ministry as a pastor of your church, uh, and also about sort of the specific content. So why don't we get started? I just want to ask you, you post things, you and Eric Kahn both will post things that explode on Twitter and just have tons of people frothing at the mouth, angry. And most of the time, those are just simply things that any cultural American would have said 60 years ago. They're not way out there wild ideas, but they seem to be today. Um, do you remember when that first started happening to you, as you're posting on social media and suddenly you start getting the woke mob attacking and angry?
Yeah, it was probably 2019 or so. Um, I've been on Twitter since 2011, but I really started to use Twitter more actively in 2018, 2019. And at the same time, our church had been reforming.
Mhm.
In one of the biggest directions we've been reforming in, that was reflected in my preaching, and because it's in my preaching, it's in my thinking. It's what I'm chewing on every day. It really related a lot to just boringly ordinary applicational theology. Um, Sort of making the step outside of the gospel-centered preaching trap where you're only allowed to say when you get to a moral imperative,
Right.
you know, the Bible says to do this. Well, Jesus did that for you. Therefore, look to Jesus in faith. Amen. And never moving on to, and now you're God's new humanity. Therefore, go and imitate Christ, imitate the Father as beloved children. So I started talking, tweeting, preaching about pretty ordinary things that I saw in culture, areas where I thought, here's a disconnect between the doctrine of the scriptures and what the church has always professed and our practice. And some of that landed in lots of different areas, but one of them that initially just, no matter, it seemed like no matter what I'd say about the topic, no matter how carefully I tried to phrase it, to avoid unnecessary offense, the topic of modesty, sexed piety, these kinds of things just, and if you remember at that time, those were very much at the forefront of the cultural conversation surrounding things like the manosphere and like the first inklings of pushback against rampant feminist culture.
Right.
So those things just started to go viral. Um, Sometimes Christian viral, which is like the BD Anyabuile and Beth Moore is tweeting at you,
Mhm.
and then occasionally actual viral where Adidas is tweeting topless photos at you, and I had both experiences multiple times in that sort of window, and kind of all went either uphill or downhill from there depending on your perspective, I suppose.
Right. So yeah, it seems like manosphere. There's a word I haven't heard for a long time,
Mhm.
actually. You said it, and I thought, wow, I haven't heard
Yeah.
that for a while. Um, so you mentioned, trying to avoid unnecessary provocation. Like you're saying things that are provocative to our culture. You're trying to avoid unnecessary provocation, but it's still provocation
Hmm.
in our culture. I just talked to Zach Garris on this podcast about his book Honor Thy Fathers, which is really about how deeply entrenched our assumptions are in our culture today, just by feminism, how deeply affected all of us have been growing up by feminism, whether we realized it or not. And then reading the reformers, they seem sort of wildly right-wing manosphere type guys. And that was just every single Christian always up until the 1800s. It was
Yeah.
before feminism came along. How do you distinguish unintentional provocation
Hmm.
from I guess I should say you don't want to be unintentionally provocative, right?
Yeah, always on purpose. Yeah.
Unnecessarily, but you want to be necessarily provocative. How do you distinguish that?
Yeah, and that's a really important key actually to anybody who's using something like social media, because it's a public platform by nature. It's an agon. It's a place where ideas are coming into conflict. It's necessarily and almost definitionally going to be a combative sort of environment. So because of that, I have a couple rules when I'm tweeting, or tweeting's the main one, Xing, whatever we call it now. Um, I try to only say things that I could defend from the pulpit.
Mm,
So I assume that anything I say online is going to be brought before my elders. Someone's going to email them. I'm going to have to give some congregant is going to ask. Someone in my parish is going to say, "Hey, Pastor Sauvé, you said this. Explain." So I try to only say things I can defend from the pulpit, and then I want to be very intentional. If I'm trying to provoke, I want the aspects of the message that are provoking to be on purpose and carefully crafted. So in the modesty conversation, occasionally this would look like poking the idols of the day in both eyes, which is one of them was particularly at this time, I think Christians were realizing that there had been this development in Christian piety where there was like an 11th commandment that you could never say that women sin, or you could never say that women sin in ways
right.
that are particular to the nature of their womanhood, or that were particular temptations for women. And so I noticed that and I said, I think this is an idol, and so I'm going to occasionally poke this idol in both eyes for the protection of my people, and also to uh, do what Christians have always done, which is make war with idols publicly. So that did mean sometimes I would use a word like whore, or a word like or talk specifically about, hey, what's the difference between sending your daughter to a pool in a bikini and sending her to the mall in lingerie? And that's pretty provocative, right?
Right.
I know that the broad culture is going to hate that, but even more specifically, I know that Christians largely are going to be offended by that language. So I'm not trying to give unnecessary offense, but I am trying to give tactical and calculated offense for the purposes of teaching, instruction, rebuke, correction, training in righteousness. Yeah, and I think we see examples of this throughout the scriptures, um, of both measured, reasonable, very careful Paul before Agrippa kind of dialogue, and Paul saying that all the Cretans are lazy, lying, gluttonous beasts. So there's a range there that I
Right.
think pastors need to have on their tool belt.
In terms of the offense, where does that offense come from? Because it seems like a reasonable question to say, okay, what's the difference between lingerie and a bikini? They cover the same amount of skin.
Mhm.
And it would seem like if someone wants to say, no, we're going to defend, you know, one or the other, it should be a pretty easy answer for them, right? If they believe they're in the right and believe they have a good defense, they could just answer and say, well, here's the difference. And it's a big difference, Brian. And I'm going to explain it to you right now. But
Yeah.
instead they get really angry. Where's that offense come from?
Well, you notice that when somebody has an inconsistency in their ethical framework, particularly an inconsistency between what ought to be their stated ethical beliefs and their practice, is that when you attack that, especially to the degree that it lands on some central feature of their self-perception, rather than attempt to argue directly with the issue, because they often can't.
Right.
In this illustration, it's just so obvious that all you can do is really resort to obfuscation, misdirection, red herring, personal attack. Um, that's what, like, I remember one example of this, the Beatty on Yabuile, in one of these conversations. He was really angry that I used the word whore,
Mm,
to say. And I was like, hey, Thabiti, I use that on purpose. It's a biblical word. It describes a certain type of behavior that we ought to be warning our. I was talking to Christians, not trying to morally transform the world apart from Christ as my primary motive in that tweet. Um, and he was saying something like, well, in my neighborhood, prostitutes don't wear bikinis. And it was like, okay, cool. But I
So he
think
didn't
you
mind
know
the
what I
word
meant.
poor. He just wanted you to be more accurate in your description of how they dress. It
Yeah,
sounds
no,
like.
it was kind of funny to me because what it I thought it demonstrated was that he, he's his self-perception was, I'm a champion of women. I'm a champion
Mhm.
of the dignity of women. Here's this guy who is unnecessarily hating on women. We need to protect the women from this guy, Brian Suave,
Right.
you know. And this happens a lot. And so it's the white knight phenomenon. They come in and they say, I will champion the cause of women. And they're missing that my point was, if you don't hold the line on something like modesty, particularly as a standard of Christian ethical practice, you don't love your daughters, your the women of your church. You actually are just handing them over to the charnel house of modern sexual deviancy to be chewed up, commodified, and turned into a token, their sexuality a token to be bought and sold on the digital marketplace. So who loves women? Like the guy
Right.
who says, don't dress like a prostitute, like Solomon does in the Proverbs. Sons don't go after the woman who dresses like that, who acts like that. Or the person who says, but prostitutes don't wear bikinis, Brian. Actually,
Right. We've
sorry, I
seen
don't have prostitutes in my neighborhood.
right. We've seen a similar thing just since last Saturday in the shooting, um, where anyone who says, "Hey guys, maybe we shouldn't be throwing women in front of bullets for men,"
Right.
the response is, "Well, why do you hate women so much?
Yeah.
Maybe the
I
women
got a
shouldn't
lot
be
of that.
dying for us." Well, why do you hate women? It
Yeah.
sounds the opposite. Um, but it is sort of an idea in our culture that the worst thing you can do to a woman is not to protect her modesty or to protect her physically from harm, but to deny her the ability to be a man. Right? That's the worst thing you could possibly do, is to deny her her right to act
Oh
like
yeah.
a man. Um, so in terms of your approach, I'm guessing you've probably read Doug Wilson's The Serrated Edge at some point, right?
Yeah. I think I read it around 2019.
Right.
And it
Uh,
was a great book at crystallizing some of these. Yes, exact. That's what I'm talking about here. The dangers for the serrated edge guy to avoid,
right.
but also a theological and practical justification for how to go about this serrated edge.
Right. One of the things I remember, and I don't know if you remember this because I literally don't really know how old you are, but um, I think I'm just a little bit older. So I remember Credenda Agenda magazine back in the early 2000s, reading that coming out of Canon, and one of the things that really hooked me was that it had an edge to it. There was provocation, but behind that provocation, there was just so much jollity. It was
Yeah.
fun, and you could tell they were having a lot of fun with it. I get the same sort of vibe when I'm reading stuff you write, stuff Eric Kahn writes, stuff coming out of King's Hall, even watching the recent what was the name of the conference?
Oh,
That was
building
there?
Christian Burroughs.
Building Christian. Yeah,
Yeah, the
just
Christian
just
Prep
the
Conference.
speeches, the panel discussion. There's a lot of joy behind it that seems to contextualize that, and it seems like critics often miss that and think they're seeing like a bunch of grumpy, angry people who just are
Yeah.
cantankerous about the world. What's the importance of attitude when you've got a platform and a lot of people watching, um, and you're tweeting out provocative things?
Yeah, Pastor Wilson does a good job, if I remember correctly, in the serrated edge of talking about this. That if you are if you have acid under your texting thumbs and your heart is full of constant roiling rage, and you're just easily provoked and easily annoyed, and anything that happens, even bad things out in culture, have the ability to very quickly get under your skin and push you around, then you are not ready to be involved in any kind of serrated edge content, because you're not self-ruled. What we don't want, it feels like we're treating bad things out in the world as if they're adequately bad when we get really mad constantly. Um, the problem is the world is so full of evil that if you wanted, you could just be enraged all the time if you
Right.
wanted to be. But there's a reason that James warns that the anger of man doesn't accomplish the righteousness of God. that the Proverbs are constantly warning against the hot-headedness, that the qualifications are for elders, they're not given to fits of rage. Like there's lots of reasons that it's temperate men who are fundamentally jolly and full of joy that I think are most qualified for this work. And it really gets to something that's actually, I've been seeing this a lot in scripture lately as I preach through Ephesians in my church, that this is a characteristic of God that we
Mm.
often miss, is that the Father fundamentally is not full of rage. The Father has anger, righteous anger at sin. God
Right.
has righteous anger at sin, but God is love. When you bump into God, what spills out of God, like you could, to put it colloquially,
Right.
is the kind of joy, like the holiness of the joy of righteousness, the gladness of holiness, this perfectly clean being who is overflowing with goodness, the Father of lights, from whom comes down every good and perfect gift, the Father who says to his people, "Fear not, little flock; it's my good pleasure to give you my kingdom." We often approach God as if he's fundamentally mad at us all the time,
Mm.
and so we sort of stay out of his presence as much
Right.
as possible. But we're his covenant people. Like God is full of joy and gladness.
Mm.
And people that become like God are people who are um, full of deep joy and deep gladness. That is because it's anchored in God himself, this unchanging God. It's not a quixotic, changeable, sort of impermanent joy that can be pushed around by any passing enemy. When an enemy comes around, I want to be the one who is provoking them. I
Right.
don't want them to have the ability to climb into the seat of my heart and push me around. I want to be in control. Um, so I think this is a very, very important consideration for Christians to get right, just in general, like to understand that sanctification actually doesn't look like becoming more dour. It doesn't mean that you're frothy and fizzy and always, cracking a joke necessarily. You have range, but it does mean that at the center there should be a gladness.
Right. And that's why we don't make wrath an attribute of God,
Hmm.
right? We can say God is love
Yeah.
because what's the saying? All that is in God is God, right?
Hmm.
God is love, but we don't say God is wrath.
Right.
His wrath is actually a function of his love.
Exactly.
Because he loves what is good, and because he loves his creation, his wrath is poured out on anything that attacks that.
Hmm.
And even as you're talking, I'm thinking, that's really any anger we have toward the world should be because of the love we have for what is good. We
That's
love
right.
God's people. We love his church. We want purity and peace in his church. And so the anger comes from a place of love versus um, the anger being foundational, I guess you would say, right?
Yeah. When I'm angry, um, the command is be angry and do not sin.
Right.
And so something I tell my church all the time in sermons or counseling, or, in various contexts, something to the effect of anger, it's not unrighteous in itself.
Hmm.
You can have righteous anger, and we ought to be angry at a lot of things that are happening in the world. But anger, right, even righteous anger has to be quickly turned into righteous action, or it will curdle into
Hmm.
something poisonous. So when I'm angry and it's something that's totally out of my control, let's say, I need to turn that to the righteous anger of prayer and trusting in the Lord and reminding myself of his providence and providential leadership over all things, and that he's turning all these things in creation to his purposes. When I'm angry at some situation in life that I have control over, I need to take righteous action to go and order what's in my domain to earthly and heavenly good, to the best with everything in my strength. And so then the anger can be directed towards righteous action. And that righteous action can be talking too, because sometimes people want to put a wet blanket on you with
Hmm.
these verses and say the anger of man doesn't, accomplish the righteousness of God. So Brian, you sound angry online, or this,
Right.
are you always talking about this problem online? And I'm like, well, part of the righteous action that righteous anger needs to be turned towards is often words. In
Hmm.
the world God made, words are powerful. He made it that way. So when people online, like myself or other people, are going and pointing words at a problem, it's not doing nothing to do
Right.
that. That's actually an important thing. And so, lest we put a wet blanket on every zealous young man and say, like, oh, anytime you talk about a problem, you're just full of anger and you're an
Mm.
idolater. You need to be joyful like God. Like, well, hang on. Like, make sure that that you're actually addressing sin and not just that person doing what they're supposed to.
Right. I think that's that angle of, young men are zealous. I remember when I was in my 20s, freshly Calvinistic, ready to conquer the world and be angry at every Arminian and dispensationalist that existed. I had really strong men around me who I could see being zealous in a different way,
Hmm.
with moderation and with wisdom, and that was able to temper me. Sometimes I do see what you're talking about, where older men, it's not that they've learned to control their zeal, it's that they've lost it, and they're just status quo getting along. And so they try to put wet blankets on young men, and I think a lot of times that's what will radicalize a young man against the church,
Hmm.
if he sees the older men doing that. I've got a question from the other side now. So we've been talking about jollity behind the social media interaction, behind the tweets. There's a core there that's not angry. What would you say to someone from the other side who says, well, maybe there ought to be? You seem flippant. How in the world can you joke about things that are so bad? Shouldn't you be a little more caustic, a little more angry, um, instead of laughing in the face of such a terrible, terrible culture as we live in?
Yeah, and that's a fair point. My fundamental position is that men ought to have range, that the saints need range. So I need to know when to be grave and sober, when to be joyful and jolly, when to be funny, when to be, have range across the spectrum. Um, I do think that we have a tendency in the church to underestimate the potency of jolliness, joy, and
Mhm.
jokes, of humor, to actually make our words more effective. So this comes from, I think, a good motive, which is to be very precise and speak the truth and to take seriously serious things. And um, that's a good motive. We don't want to make light of God, for example. We don't want to make light of, um, you know, truly horrible, deep evils. However, there's a way of using lightness in your speech or humor in your speech that's actually taking those things very seriously, um, and actually doing so by aiming to be as effective as possible in communicating the important message,
Right.
understanding how God made human beings. And one of the features of human beings is that we're not merely persuaded by logic, but we're persuaded by pathos and ethos, and we're persuaded by all sorts of rhetorical tools. And again, people can be like, this is a deficiency in people, that they can be persuaded by rhetoric.
Right.
And it can be, but it's also just a feature of how God made us. We're not
Right.
brains on a stick. We're not artificial intelligence, neural network computers crunching data. People operate on a sub-rational level often, and this is actually a part of our holistic, I think, makeup from a creational perspective. Like if
Right.
we were perfect and unfallen, the all of those things, the logos, the pathos, the ethos, they would all come together and it would be perfect balance. So we're out of balance a lot of different
Right.
places, but I think using all the tools is just actually recognizing something God did when he made the
Right.
world.
Well, even a pagan like Aristotle, who was sort of the ultimate logic codifier, he wrote the book on logic. Um, Even he recognized in his rhetoric, he said, "Your personal character, what people think of you as a person, is the most powerful persuasive tool you have."
Mm.
So he put ethos at the top of persuasive tools because he said, we do wrong to think that a man's character has nothing to do with his power of persuasion. It's the most powerful tool he has. So even in a pagan context, people can see this about humanity. We believe people we admire, people we think are good, or or we can relate to. We think that person's got it figured out. Look at them. I'm much more willing to believe them than the cantankerous, angry person who his logic may be right. We've all known that, right? Like the Calvinist in the cage stage, who his arguments are right and he's
Right.
beating up everybody around him and nobody's being persuaded because
Mhm.
no one
Yeah.
likes him. He's
Nobody.
not a likable person.
No.
Um, so I wanted to shift a little bit here. You're a pastor. That's your calling. God's called you to your local flock. Um, Social media, you have a big social media influence out there beyond your flock. How do you see those two as relating to one another? So when you post on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, do you see that as an extension of your ministry? Does that
Oh,
benefit your church in some way?
yeah.
How would you connect those?
Yeah. So in some cases, it's an extension. It's very direct, where I'm talking as a pastor to issues of Christian theology, application, pastoral theology, things like that. Sometimes I'm talking to other pastors. Sometimes I'm just talking as a Christian man in a nation who I have a vocation of pastor. But when I talk to a political issue or something, sometimes I'm talking about it pastorally. Sometimes I'm just talking about it as a citizen of this commonwealth. And I'm a Christian man who happens to be a pastor, and so I can speak from that vocation to a specific thing outside of my specific domain and sphere of authority and influence and things like that.
Right.
But I do mainly focus on social media and in podcasts and things like that in making the kind of content and saying the kind of things that I think would this edify my church? What kind of fruit will this produce in my church, my people, my parish? Even is in our church, all of our pastors have responsibility to the whole flock, but also we divide our membership up into parishes.
Right.
So I have like 20 or 30 families, for example, right now that like they're my direct families. They know they have an issue, they come to me. I'm counseling them, that sort of thing. And so that shapes in both directions what I say, thinking about shaping them, but also um, what they're going through, the things that are regularly coming up in counseling, or that shapes how I talk um, online quite a bit. I'm often thinking about them first before
Right.
I'm thinking about the world.
Has anything any controversy that has been stirred up around you on social media, has any of that ever had any direct effect with your personal flock? Have you had people come to you and say, Pastor, what's going on? Why are all these people angry? And how does
Yeah,
that
almost
affect us?
almost all of them. Especially at first, almost all of them, it'd be like, "What's happening? Are you guys?" Some people like, "Are you guys okay?" People are mad at you online. I'm like, we're okay.
Right.
Um, or I don't know if I agreed with that. Let's talk about that. And this is
Mm,
part of pastoring. That's part of like the instinct I pointed at the very beginning of this conversation, that noticing a gap between our teaching of Scripture and its moral implications and the application of those things to the people. Um, it's not necessarily a sign of failure when someone in your congregation comes to you and says, "I don't agree with that," because
right.
now I have an opportunity to say, let's open the scriptures. Let's talk about it. Let's figure this out. And if I'm wrong, I'm fallible, or maybe I was off
Right.
by degrees. Maybe it wasn't black or white wrong, but maybe I was off by degrees. Or I can just explain my motive. Some of the time it's saying, like, sister, maybe you need to understand sort of the difference between a masculine public setting where there's confrontation and that not being bad in itself, um,
Right.
causing controversy not being bad in itself. And sometimes it's, let's talk about this moral issue. Sometimes it's, um, oh, you misunderstood what I said. I actually meant this, not that. But it's a net positive. Like, it's all net positive because it's bringing things out into the light. A lot of our conversations surrounding sex piety, Christian education, Christian political engagement have been very fruitful in our church. And then the result has been, now, I mean, we're looking like 5, 6 years into being more active on social media now. Our church is incredibly like-minded. We also know a lot about what the others are thinking about things because we've
Right.
talked about them now. They're not just private thoughts. We've brought them into the conversation of our community as well in men's book studies and signal chats and uh, pastoral counseling and all sorts of contexts. So the
Right.
net result has been great unity as well.
It reminds me a little bit of um, I know we're running a little low on time here, but just sort of the early Reformation period when you had the printing press just churning out thousands of these little pamphlets that were extremely provocative and extremely polarizing at the time, but also served to unify the Protestants, served to unify, even in Wittenberg, Luther Luther was known as a pastor to his flock, and outside of Wittenberg, he's the guy that writes all these inflammatory pamphlets that are going everywhere. I see a real similarity in the way God has brought us to this point and given us this technology today. So,
I absolutely
yeah.
agree. Social media is one of these, it's absolutely a gift and a tool that, I mean, think about what would the last week have been like if we didn't have Twitter, but specifically if we didn't have Twitter after in God's providence, Elon Musk dropping 43 billion
Right.
to buy it and at least drastically limit certain types of the censorship that had been happening. These things are in God's providence, huge gifts and opportunities for Christians. I mean, this week so far, let me just look this up real quick. The last 7 days on Twitter, a nobody in Ogden named Brian Sauvé, like 2 million people have seen things I've said. And that's insane.
Right.
7 days. This year, 30 million. That's crazy. I mean, that's that. I'm not saying those are all unique. Some of those are the same people seeing things more than once. I
Right.
can't get too granular. But just as a number, it's like there's 330 million people in our nation ish. And we have the power now in our hands directly to bring the light of the Christian worldview and the gospel and the law and the gospel and all these things into the public sphere and disciple Christians, to evangelize the lost, to engage in important, like we can have a voice on the national stage. We were just talking about this, like the distance between the vice president of the United States and people I know who are reading things that are being written on Twitter and related entities
Right.
is like 1 or 2 degrees. That's crazy that these American reformers writing articles that it's highly likely that JD Vance is going to read at some point.
Right.
That's powerful, and that's a gift of God
Yeah.
to be stewarded well.
Right. Well, thank you, Brian, for sitting down and talking to me today. This has been a real fun time, and yeah, thanks for giving your time to me on the podcast.
I'll appreciate it. It was a joy to join you this morning and hope that it blesses your listeners.